technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. We've got 2 great hours for you. In our second hour, we're going to go to Barry Arrington. He is an attorney, sometimes aligned with Alliance Defending Freedom. He's in Washington right now. He was at the Supreme Court hearing today on the transgender issue. But we're going to be talking with him in the second hour about his new book, Unforgetting God, Defeating Culture-Destroying Materialism through Christian Renewal. And joining me for that also will be Charles Stolfus. He is he's with the Denton Bible Church. He is a director of their Theological Institute. He's also a director of their Young Guns program. He's joining me here in studio. But before we go to Barry Arrington, we're going to go to the country's #1 tax expert, Dan Pilla. He has been on here. I think he started with Point of View back in the 1980s, providing us with tax information. And because we have the One Big Beautiful Bill out there, we wanted to talk to him about that. He's a regular appears here on radio and television. He is also published in a number of major newspapers. I think he has a piece in National Review frequently. He is a consultant with the National Commission on Restructuring the IRS. He's also the executive director of the Tax Freedom Institute, which is a National Association of Tax Professionals. And we're here to get Dan to tell us about this One Big Beautiful Bill. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure, Merrill. Thanks for having me. I appreciate being on as usual.
Okay.
And, well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead and finish.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, you mentioned the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I mean, the good news is that Congress finally passed the what amounts to an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You and I have talked about this at length over the past several years here, really. And so the One Big Beautiful Bill essentially insofar as the tax aspects are concerned, as you well know, there's all different kinds of facets to this thing, which is why they call it the One Big Beautiful Bill, right? Because it's got all these different elements to it. But the tax aspects are basically, Merrill, a reenactment of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed by Congress and took effect in January of 2018. That was President Trump's first tax law, and that was responsible for cutting taxes pretty significantly for individuals and small businesses. And the One Big Beautiful Bill, it's just called the Beautiful Bill. That basically does the same thing. There's not a lot of news. Of course, there is some new stuff, but there's not a tremendous amount of new stuff in the bill. What it does do primarily is extend, as I said, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and so that's where we're at with that. Now, of course, we've got different aspects of it that are new. You've got the treatment of overtime pay, Social Security pay, and unemployment compensation. So that's, those elements are new in the bill.
Explain to our listeners this issue, because when they passed the bill in 2017, it went to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2018. It was a lot of those tax cuts were limited in time, and they would have ended this year. And so, when the way the Congressional Budget Office does what we call scoring this, estimating it, it has to take what the law is when it looks at the cost of a new bill. And most of us said, well, it's really doesn't cost that much because we're just extending these. The way the Congressional Budget Office had to assume that all those tax cuts, tax breaks would end, and therefore they saw a huge new bill there.
Well, yeah, that's true, and so the scoring does get a little odd. And here's the other problem with the scoring that the OMB does, and the Congressional Budget Office, and these various components there in Washington that look at these things. They use, Merrill, as you well know, static scoring. all right, as opposed to dynamic scoring. And so, for example, if you have a tax base, let's say your tax base is $1,000 of economic activity, and you want to impose a 10% tax on this $1,000 of economic activity, well, then the presumption is that you're going to raise $100 by doing that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's static scoring. You just apply the simple math formula to your tax base, and you say, okay, that's how much revenue we're going to get. Dynamic scoring takes into account the human element that tax burdens put on people's incentive to produce. All right, and so if you've got $1,000 worth of activity and you put a 10% tax on that activity, you are going to have some element of discouragement to produce at that level of $1,000, and so you might not collect $100 of tax revenue from that tax. You might only collect $80 or $85 or $90. Now, the fact of the matter is, the lower the tax rate that is imposed on economic activity, the least distortion that it creates in the marketplace. The higher the tax rate, the greater distortion that's created. For example, if we put a 100% tax, Merrill, on all income in the United States, would we collect 100% of the income? Well, the answer is clearly no, because people aren't going to go to work and work for nothing, right? Mm-hmm. And so the fact is, you put 100% tax on somebody's wages, and you're going to collect zero revenue from that 100% tax, because people just won't go to work in the morning if they're just simply working for nothing, if all of their money is going to the government. So this is the human element of the consequences, what we call distortions, that the OMB and the Congressional Budget Office does not take into effect. So when you lower tax rates, you raise tax revenue, and that's been proven over and over and over again. And this is why it's so important to understand why tax cuts are so critical. They actually increase revenue. Now, that assumes, Merrill, that you want to actually put more money in the hands of the government, where I would take the position that you got to cut rates sufficiently to not only stimulate economic activity and stimulate growth, but actually cut revenue to the government. We don't want the government getting more money. We want the government getting less money.
Dan, this is Charles Stolfus here in the studio with Buddy. I understand that another portion of the Big Beautiful Bill had to do with the expiring child tax credit, making that permanent, and in fact even increasing that. Do you see that as a good thing?
Well, yeah, it's a good thing in the sense that it's going to allow middle-income taxpayers to keep more of their money. There's no question about that. I'm in favor of tax cuts everywhere and anywhere, and I am not in favor of all the tinkering around the edges that the Big Beautiful Bill represents, and that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act represented. And frankly, every tax bill that's come down the pike here in the last 25 or 30 years has just been this glorious attempt to tinker around the edges, to tweak this provision and tweak that provision. I really think that we got to stop that and have, if you want to call it a moratorium on tax law changes, but I don't know how that's ever going to happen. Every time there's a new power in Washington, whether it's at the White House or in Congress, the first thing they want to do is change the tax laws, and it's just, to me it's reprehensible, because these constantly changing tax laws make it impossible for individuals and businesses to plan their futures.
We'll be back with tax expert Dan Pilla in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Columnist Barton Swaim wrote about the left's vast lack of knowledge. He focused on it because of the bungled attempts by liberal journalists to describe Charlie Kirk and his impact. He pointed to articles that pieced together random quotations attributed to Charlie Kirk without any context. One of the quotes attributed to him made him sound like a Jew hater of the 1930s. He was, in fact, quoting a social media post that he critiqued, But the liberal journalist responsible for the quotes didn't even stop to think that Charlie Kirk had always been a staunch defender of Israel and the Jewish people. Barton Swaim used to assume that liberals and progressives knew more about their conservative opposites than vice versa. But he says more than one reader pointed to Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. Perhaps one of the people who wrote to him heard my radio commentary 6 years ago on the subject. At the time, I had a co-host who'd argued that both sides of the political spectrum make wrong assumptions about the other. While that is true, conservatives usually know more about liberals than liberals know about conservatives. Jonathan Haidt is probably best known for his books, The Coddling of the American Mind and The Anxious Generation. His book, The Righteous Mind, documents a detailed study of predictions liberals and conservatives made about each other. Moderates and conservatives made the most accurate predictions. Liberals made the least accurate. And I might mention there are other studies, such as the research by Arthur Brooks. He found a significant perception gap when studying Democrats and Republicans. All these studies illustrate why it is important for us to use discernment when consuming media. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on chemical abortion, go to viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. Viewpoints.info/chemical abortion.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And back with our discussion with Dan Pilla, tax expert extraordinaire. Joining me in studio, Charles Stolfus with Denton Bible Church. And Dan, one of the things that the president did was he wanted to eliminate taxes on tips. I wasn't a big fan of that. I'm happy for people keeping more money, but that oftentimes creates kind of an inclination to try to call more things tips. In fact, the other day I was talking to an attorney, and he mentioned he got a check from one of his clients, and the client had given him a little more because he thought the attorney had done a great job. And he said, I'm going to call that a tip because it's not taxed. I don't know if he was, I'm not sure if he was serious or not, but talk about these tax on tips. And will people call more things tips now?
Well, that's a good question. And the fact of the matter is that's exactly what my concern was. I recall you and I talking about this back in the spring when the president issued his, what I've come to call his big three tax cut proposals, which is tax cuts on tip income, overtime pay, and Social Security benefits. It didn't come out of the congressional meat grinder anyway, anywhere looking like what it did when it went in, which was complete elimination of taxes on all these things. It wasn't even close. But the answer to your question is that the limitation on tip income is narrow. All right, there's not 100% exclusion for tip income, and so an individual can exclude up to $25,000 of tip income, and it's only for a select number of years, Merrill. It's not permanent. It goes from 2025 through 2028 only. And for overtime pay, it's $12,500. But as to tip income, and as to your concern, I had exactly the same concern. I wrote about this in a National Review piece, and as I said, I'm sure you and I talked about it. But the fact of the matter is the IRS has now come out with guidelines as to what constitutes tip income and what doesn't. And typically, it is those that traditionally have worked in service industries. All right, we're talking about bars, restaurants, any type of service industry. Specifically, legal, to my chagrin and to your friend's chagrin, legal fees don't, income earned in the legal industry does not constitute tip income, regardless of what the client calls it. So there is a you can go on the IRS's website, irs.gov, and if you just put in their search box the guidelines on tip income, you'll come up with this laundry list. It's like a 15-page list, Merrill, of things that constitute tip income and areas that the IRS is not going to recognize it as tip income. So the guidance is out there now.
Hey, Dan, I'm a pastor at a church, and I know a lot of people that work for religious nonprofits. Is there anything in this bill that will affect in any significant way churches and religious nonprofits?
Well, yeah, there actually is. The Congress came up with an additional deduction for charitable contributions. All right, now ordinarily charitable contributions have to be claimed on your Schedule A, which is itemized deductions. And what happens in an itemized deduction situation, you've got to exceed the value of your standard deduction in order to get the benefit of any itemized deduction. Well, the standard deduction now for married filing jointly, pastor, is about $31,000. Right, so the combination of your state income taxes, charitable contributions, medical expenses, and mortgage interest have to exceed that number in order to get any benefit. Well, what the big beautiful bill did is it added a charitable contribution available for those who do not itemize deduction. All right, so now this is a deduction of $1,000 for individuals or $2,000 for married filing jointly, and you don't have to itemize to get the deduction. So that's going to help folks that want to claim deductions for charitable giving, and of course it's incentive to give for those that might not otherwise do so.
Dan, there's been a long-running standard, I think, of coming from Lyndon Johnson, that if you're a church, you could not advocate for specific candidates, you could not advocate for specific laws, or you might lose your tax-exempt status. I think I understand that some people would say that would not actually hold under constitutional standard if it gets pressed, but I think I've heard some discussion about saying we're not even going to do that anymore. Do you have any insight on that?
Well, yeah, I do, Merrill. In fact, I've written about that quite extensively here in the last 60 or 90 days. What you're referring to is the so-called Johnson Amendment that was put into Code Section 501c3. 501c3 is the provision of the Internal Revenue Code that exempts religious, charitable, educational organizations, a number of others, but primarily religious, charitable, and educational. And that provision that Lyndon Johnson was responsible for getting into the law when he was a U.S. Senator in the late 1950s prohibits churches from expressing opinions on specific candidates for public office or getting involved in specific issues that are ballot issues, right? And so what that has essentially done, Merrill, in my opinion, is it bought the silence of the Christian church under the idea that if they speak out against, for example, abortion laws or same-sex marriage or homosexual type things, that they somehow then would come under scrutiny from the IRS and lose their exempt status. So churches have kept their mouth shut for 50, 60 years now as a result of that. What has happened here is the national religious broadcasters and a couple of churches in Texas actually sued the United States government, challenging the constitutionality of the Johnson Amendment, and that case is now working its way through the courts, and there is a consent judgment or a consent decree, I should say, that's on the table in that case where the IRS and the Justice Department is agreeing that they will not enforce the Johnson Amendment against churches when pastors are speaking from the pulpit on issues related to their ordinary biblical teaching in the context of sermons to their congregation. So to make this very simple, if a pastor says that the Christian view of marriage is one man and one woman for life, and that a homosexual marriage would be antithetical to the Christian view, the biblical view, that would not be prohibited speech, subject to losing their exempt status. Instead, it's constitutionally protected speech under the First Amendment.
Well, in this area, many times churches put together voters' guides that really articulate positions on certain views. Many times we get them in a kind of a nonpartisan way, but still, in some sense, they are advocating one side over the other. Is that a legal thing? Is that something that churches can do or will continue to be able to do?
Well, voters' guides have always been permissible as long as they were neutral as to the church's position. So candidate A believes A, B, and C. Candidate B believes A, B, and C, right? And so we've got or I should say D, E, and F, right? Because we've got this distinction between the candidates. If the church simply did nothing but list the two candidates or three candidates and their respective views and distributed that document to their congregation, that would not be a violation of the Johnson Amendment. Where the violation would come in is if the church came out and said, candidate A believes in abortion, candidate B believes in life. We support candidate B. We think you should vote for candidate B. That, under present law, would be a violation of the Johnson Amendment. What this consent judgment is going to do, Pastor, is it's going to allow you as pastor to stand in the pulpit and say, you as a Christian have a responsibility to vote your conscience. And that means when you go in that voter's booth, you should be voting for life. You should be voting to support an unborn child. You should not be voting to institute laws and policies that allow people to indiscriminately destroy human life. That, under this lawsuit, that would be permissible speech.
Well, just to follow on this whole idea here, I've heard that even apart from a proposed consent decree or however it ultimately gets reconciled in the Supreme Court, I've heard that no church has ever been prosecuted for a violation of the Johnson Amendment because it's so on its face unconstitutional. Where do you fall on that?
Well, prosecution is the wrong word because it's not criminal conduct. All right, so under no set of circumstances would any church ever be prosecuted under the Johnson Amendment. The risk is that a church would come under civil investigation for the potential revocation of its exempt status. And in the lawsuit that the NRB brought against the United States, they did cite a number of cases where religious organizations, churches, and educational organizations did come under scrutiny for their views regarding these different, what we would call biblical issues.
Thank you, Dan. That was a good answer on that. My guest, Dan Pilla, we're going to be talking about tax issues. Dan is also an expert on business tax. So when we come back from the break, if you have a question about taxes, give us a call at 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We will take your calls, and we'll also ask about tax simplification. Seems like the tax system's getting more complicated rather than less so. Stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And if you would like to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212 is the number. We have tax expert Dan Pilla. I have never found a tax question he didn't have an answer for, but maybe you can stump him if you call. And Dan, we've got somebody on the line. We've got Randall from Oregon, and he has a question about an annuity. Let me see if I can get him up here. Randall, you're on the air.
Yeah, I'm actually from Oklahoma, but anyway, it doesn't matter. I've got liability to the IRS of $5,000. Well, it's over $5,000, and it was because I took out an annuity and bought a house and didn't have taxes withheld on it, and so anyway, this tax wise or right or whatever company told me, well, I wouldn't have to pay the liability if I can prove to the IRS that I'm not financially able to pay for it, but it would take like 10 years for this to come off my record. Now, they was going to,
let me stop you right there. Let me stop you, Wendell, because you're talking about two different things here. All right. Number one, this company is alluding to, although they probably don't know what the heck they're talking about, just on the basis of what the information is that you're giving me here now. The number one strategy that I try to use with people who can't pay the tax they owe is to use what's called an offer in compromise. An offer in compromise is the IRS's program that allows you to go in there and say, look, guys, I owe you $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever the number is, but I can't afford to pay that amount of money. I can afford to pay X dollars. X might be 10 cents on the dollar, 20, 30. There's no magic number because it's based on your income and expenses, and it's based on your assets and liabilities, right? That's called an offer in compromise program. If you make an offer in compromise to the IRS and they accept that, the liability goes away as long as you pay the offered amount. I owe you 50, I'm going to pay 5, I pay the 5, the rest of the liability goes away. All right, the 10-year deal is something completely different. The 10 years is a collection statute of limitations. The IRS has 10 years from the date a tax is assessed in which to collect it, and if they can't collect it within 10 years, then the liability goes away. Now, that 10-year period of time is the clock, all right? The clock is ticking. If you do absolutely nothing, then that liability will eventually run out. However, Randall, it is important to understand that the IRS does its best to not let these liabilities expire. All right? They try to engage in active collection during that period of time that the tax is collectible to collect as much money as they can before the statute runs out. So generally speaking, a new tax liability, when I say new, I mean something that's recently assessed and the IRS has got, 8, 9, 10 years to collect, that's not an effective strategy to try to wait that out.
Okay.
So now I will tell you this, Randall.
Like an offer of compromise?
Well, it's called an offer in compromise. I wrote a book called How to Get Tax Amnesty. That book, How to Get Tax Amnesty, is the preeminent guide to negotiating settlements with the IRS. I have a chapter in the book on the offer in compromise. I also have a chapter in the book on the statute of limitations to explain exactly how these things work.
And Dan, you could probably find that book on your website, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Go to taxhelponline.com. That's all one word, taxhelponline.com. And all my books are available there, including How to Get Tax Amnesty.
Well, Randall, give that a shot. See if that helps. Thank you. So, Dan, you are a business tax expert. Are there business provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill that we should know about?
Well, the most important business provision for sure is the renewal, as I said, of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that allows that maintains in effect here, Merrill, the qualified business income deduction for small businesses. Now, the qualified business income deduction is a critical deduction for businesses. It's a 20% deduction from the net bottom line of your business profit. So, for example, if let's say you got $300,000 worth of gross receipts to your business, and your business operating expenses are $100,000. That means your net business income is $200,000, and that's what you pay tax on. The qualified business income deduction is another 20% deduction off of that amount, right? So in this example, it's a $40,000 deduction that reduces then your taxable income from $200,000. In this example, it'll be reduced from $200,000 down to $160,000. So this is significant tax savings. And the thing about this deduction, Merrill, is ordinarily in order to get the benefit of a deduction, you have to spend the money, right? If you're going to get a deduction for advertising, you've got to spend money on advertising. If you're going to get a deduction for business equipment, you got to spend the money on business equipment. The qualified business income deduction does not require an expenditure. It's just a ledger book entry that just simply reduces your business taxable income from X dollars to Y dollars based on that 20% deduction. It's very, 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 very important for small businesses, and that was extended under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And that's one of the things that the the liberals in Congress were so determined to unravel, was that small business tax deduction. And they kept saying it was tax cuts for the rich, which is nonsense, because the thing phases out. The deduction phases out for married filing jointly income over, I forget the exact number, but it's over roughly $400,000, 425, something like that. So the high income people don't even get the benefit of it, and never did.
Well, that's a good point that you're making here, because you make it just a little bit clearer for me. I didn't quite follow on that. I've heard so many times that this is something that's going to help the rich. They're the ones that are getting the greatest amount of benefits here, and yet everyone else is getting no help at all.
Well, and it's fundamentally false. And and Merrill and I have talked about this a dozen times over the years. But this tax the rich mantra is absolute nonsense. All right. The fact of the matter is the top 1% of income earners in the United States earn about 22% of all of the income, and they pay about 41% of all of the income taxes. Well, how are rich people getting tax breaks and benefits that allow them to reduce their tax liability or eliminate their tax liability when they're the ones paying the vast majority? The top 10% pay over 90% of all the income taxes paid. How is that possible if rich people pay no taxes? It's just simply absurd. And all they're doing, all these liberals are doing, is inflaming the passions and prejudices of the middle class against the higher class to justify income tax increases that eventually push down into the middle class. This is what people need to understand. These tax the rich policies don't just focus on the rich. They get pushed down lower and lower and lower, because the fact of the matter is, Merrill, you know this better than I do, there just simply isn't enough wealth in this so-called billionaire class to fund the government the way they're spending money these days.
You know, during the first Trump administration, there was this push to try to simplify the tax code, and Paul Ryan, who was Speaker at the time when they passed the first tax bill, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, said we want to try to get it down so that most people could just fill out a card. But it seems to me, they didn't get it that simple, but it seems to me things have gotten much more complicated.
Well, they didn't get it. They didn't get it any close to the kind of simplification they were talking about. And as far as I'm concerned, the only way to do that is to abolish the income tax entirely and go to a completely different system. But you're exactly right, Merrill. The Tax Foundation has just released an estimate that they did on the compliance costs of the federal income tax. Now, I've been talking about compliance costs for years. In my book, How to Fire the IRS, in the early 1990s, I was talking about compliance costs, and it was that book that got the Tax Foundation on board with doing these estimates and really looking at the numbers very closely. But their most recent work now indicates that America spends almost 7.1 billion hours a year complying with the IRS's return filing and reporting requirements. I mean, think about that. And they quantify that into about more than $530 billion money spent by individuals and businesses, not on taxes, but on tax compliance.
It's amazing. Our guest for this hour is Dan Pilla. He is a tax expert. You can find out more about him at pointofview.net. We have information there. You can also reach out to him on his own tax website. And there's a number of books that he's done: Small Businesses, How to Deal with the IRS, and several books over the years, plus his National Review pieces. So I'd encourage you to go there and look at those. And if you reach out to him, Dan is an expert in these tax issues. So if you have tax problems, you can reach out to him. When we come back, we want to talk a little bit about what's happening at the IRS and whether or not the IRS is just in a unfixable mess, or can we do something? And Donald Trump may be looking for a new IRS commissioner. Has he called Dan? We don't know. We'll ask him when we come back from the break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our tax expert, Dan Pilla, for our last segment. And Charles, I think you have a question for Dan?
Yes, Dan, I understand that the commissioner of the IRS has been fired. And of course, Trump has been trying to really change so much of government to make it more efficient and to really get out the waste, fraud, and abuse. And so what kinds of changes would you think would be good to make with the IRS?
Well, what I would do with the IRS if I were in a position to do it is I'd just abolish the income tax entirely. Now, that might be a different answer, an answer to a different question, and that is, what would I do with the IRS versus what would I do with tax policy in general? What I would do with the IRS in particular is I think we got to focus, as long as we've got a tax system that's so confusing as this one is, 14 over 4 million words in the tax code with these constant changes that go on year after year. We have to focus on education, outreach, and taxpayer assistance. People will comply with the law if they understand what they're supposed to do and they have the capacity to comply, right? People don't wake up in the morning and say to themselves, how can I tick off the IRS today? I know I'll stop filing my tax returns and paying taxes. That's not what people do. They get sideways, generally speaking, due to complexity and due to circumstances beyond their control. And so the best thing the IRS can do is help people to understand, particularly small businesses, help them comply with the law so they understand what the requirements are. That needs to be the focus. So they got to have less attention on enforcement, in my opinion, more attention on taxpayer assistance. But the fact is, with the tax code so confusing, it's really a hopeless battle, in my opinion. We have got to fundamentally change the tax system.
Dan, it is very complicated, and there have been people at the IRS who targeted conservatives at some point, for especially the 501c4s, I think it was. But can you get good information from the IRS?
Well, it depends what kind of information you're looking for. I got to say their website's pretty good. They've got a search function on their website that does give us good information. What I never recommend people do is call the IRS and talk to somebody on the telephone, because now it's a crapshoot. You just don't know what you're going to get.
What changes would you make? I mean, I think there's thousands of people there who take phone calls. That's part of it. They were trying to implement a system where people could have the IRS file their compute their taxes and file it. Is that a good idea?
Well, the IRS had that free file system that they were experimenting with, and it was problematic, Merrill, because first of all, it was only half the battle, right? When you get a tax return software like TurboTax or one of these other tax prep software programs out there, it prepares your federal tax return, and then it simultaneously prepares your state tax return, and then you e-file the federal with the U.S. government, you e-file the state with your state government, and now you're done with your compliance. The IRS's free file system did not do that. You had to use two different programs in order to make it work. And so that just made it clumsier for people, not easier, all right? So they did not have a system that wrapped all the state stuff into it. Now, Congress has come along and said, okay, IRS, you're not allowed to spend any more money on a free file system. And the reason for that is because we got so many private sector companies out there that have free file software for people whose income is below a certain amount and don't have businesses and they don't have complicated tax returns, right? So they're already offering the service. And as I said, the service applies to both federal and state. So it's much more efficient for these private sector companies to do it than the IRS to do it.
You mentioned, you talked about our caller about what happens if somebody gets behind, but just run through this again. If I am behind on my taxes, I can't afford to do it, I need to do something. What are my options out there?
Well, there's a number of options. First of all, depending on how much money you owe, right? Let's say it's a relatively small amount of money, and you've got the capacity to make payments to the IRS. The IRS will entertain an installment agreement that allows you to set up a payment with the IRS to pay your bill monthly. If you owe less than $50,000 and you can pay within 72 months, it's a pretty simple process to get set up on that installment agreement. All right. There is also a program of penalty relief. All right. If you owe the IRS money, but of the money you owe, a substantial portion of that is penalties and interest. And I've had people tell me 1,000 times, I can pay the taxes. It's the penalties and interest that are killing me. All right. Well, penalties can be removed when you demonstrate that the failure to file or failure to pay was due to reasonable cause and not willful neglect. In other words, you didn't deliberately disregard your obligations. Under those circumstances, the IRS can remove the penalties. That removes the interest on the penalties. That adjusts the liability considerably and puts you in a better position to be able to pay. And then you've got the big dollar liabilities. You know, if you owe the IRS a substantial amount of money and the definition of substantial depends on the facts of the individual's case, right? What's substantial to you might not be substantial to somebody else. So it depends on the facts and circumstances of your individual case. And that's where we consider an offer in compromise. The offer in compromise, again, is the program that allows you to go in there and say, look, guys, I can't pay what I owe. Given my income, given my assets, there's no way I'm going to be able to pay this. And that then opens the door for an offer in compromise. And so let's say you owe the IRS $100,000, for example, and you say, look, I can't pay the $100,000, but I can pay $6 or $8 or $10 or $20,000. The IRS does an asset investigation. I walk you through that process in my book, and then they say, yeah, we'll accept your offer. And maybe they accept the offer, pick a number, say $15,000. Now you've got, now you pay that $15,000, and the rest of the liability is then expunged, Merrill. It goes away. And so there are all kinds of programs that are available to manage these liabilities, but the key element to every single one of them is you got to get yourself current. You must get current with delinquent tax returns, and you must be paying taxes for the current year. We're in 2025 now, so you got to get your current tax liabilities paid, and then that opens the door to utilize these resolution programs.
If I'm behind, do I need a tax person or an attorney to help me do that, or does the IRS make it fairly simple for me to walk through that process?
Well, there's nothing simple with the IRS, Merrill, unfortunately. And that's exactly why I wrote the book, How to Get Tax Amnesty, to walk people through this process. This book has been available since we introduced the book on Point of View originally in 1993, Merrill. That's how far back this book goes. It's gone through 9 complete different rewrites now since that period of time, and it's currently up to date and talks about all the programs as they operate today. But that is the key book to get you through the process of getting a resolution here.
Dan, we've got a little over a minute left. Tell us, if people go to your website, tell us what they'll find there, what they should be looking for, and what kind of information they can get.
Yeah, taxhelponline.com is the website. You go to the website, you'll see my books. You'll see a series of free information that answers questions, 29 most common questions that people have about IRS. And so I answer all those questions. That's free information. You buy any book off my website at any price point, you get a free 15-minute consultation directly and personally with me. So the site is taxhelponline.com. Buy any book at any price point, and you get a free 15-minute consultation with me. Have
you got a new book coming out?
There's not one in the works at the moment, but that could change very, very soon, Merrill. I'm determined to rewrite my book, How to Fire the IRS, which has been out of print for quite a long time now.
It would be interesting to read. We'll have you back when you do that. Thank you, Dan Pilla, for all your help.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, Charles, he knows his tax stuff.
Oh, yes, he does.
When we come back, we're going to talk to Barry Arrington. He is an attorney. He is in Washington today. We was at the Supreme Court hearing that was on the issue of transgender and so forth. So we'll get a little update from him, and we're going to talk to him about his book, Unforgetting God, where he looks at the materialist philosophy that has so spread through the country. So stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you.
It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kirby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and we're going to turn to a worldview looking at materialism, about a new book out called Unforgetting God, Defeating Culture-Destroying Materialism Through Christian Renewal. The author is Barry Arrington. He joins us by phone. He grew up in Texas, and he went to the University of Texas Law School. He's been practicing private law since 1987. He's been allied with the Alliance for Defending Freedom since 1994. But he's in Washington today. Was at the Supreme Court at an argument that was we heard today at the Supreme Court. And joining me in studio is Charles Stolfus. He is a pastor at Denton Bible Church and also is director of their Theological Institute, where he deals with issues of materialism and Christian philosophy and apologetics. So, Barry, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, start out and tell us what was going on at the Supreme Court today. What did you see happen?
Okay, so first of all, we have to set up the scenario. What was this case about? It was Childs v. Salazar. Ms. Childs is my client, and a few years ago, Alliance Defending Freedom, she called them, ADF, called them and said, well, I'm having problems with this statute that's been passed in Colorado. I'm a licensed therapist, and I need a licensed counselor, and I need help because Colorado has really made it difficult for me to do my work. And so ADF referred her to me, and I filed a lawsuit. And so what was the lawsuit entail? Well, here's a scenario. You have a 12-year-old young boy, let's say, and he goes to a licensed counselor in Colorado, and he says to her, you know, I'm having problems. Actually, I'm really, people at school are making fun of me because I want to transition, and that's really what I want to do. Well, the therapist could say, okay, let's talk about that, and let's encourage you, and let's get you on the road to transition. Okay, that's case A. Case B, same 12-year-old, same therapist. He comes in and says, I'm having problems with this gender dysphoria. Of course, they wouldn't use that word, of my sex and my body. I don't think they match. And the counselor could not say, okay, well, let me help you with that. Even if the young boy and his parents wanted the counselor to help him become comfortable with his own body, Colorado law says you can't do that. If you do, you'll lose your license and be fined $5,000. And so I said, well, that sounds like a violation of the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. And we filed a case in, 3 years ago, last month. And we lost in the district court. And so we filed an appeal. And at this time, ADF came back into the case and started helping with the appeal and in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And we lost in the Court of Appeals. Really? 10th Circuit upheld the district court. Said, yep, this law is perfectly okay. And so we had a petition for a writ of certiorari. That's how you get to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. It was granted in March. The briefing occurred over the summer and late fall or early fall, and the argument was today, and that's what the case was about.
And how did the argument go? Sometimes you say,
Jim Campbell.
You can sort of get a sense as to where the court is.
Yeah, you absolutely do. Jim Counsel, his chief legal counsel for Alliance Defending Freedom, was the one who actually did the argument in front of the Supreme Court today. I was in the courtroom, and a lot of the other members of our legal team were in the courtroom, and you really do get a sense of where the justices are leaning with body language and the tone of voice and facial expressions. They're not shy about signaling where they are. I think we're going to win 6-3 at least. We might even get Justice Kagan. Could be 7-2.
It sounds like you had a good day then.
We had a fabulous day, a wonderful day at the court. Jim did a fantastic. ADF is just, I don't know if you've ever worked with ADF. I've worked with them for 30-something years now.
And of course, we've had ADF
they do
people.
everything first rate.
We have ADF people in the Point of View fairly often, so yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, good. That sounds like I'll be interested to see how the media report it, but we got a firsthand witness who saw what happened there.
Yes. So we just let me just say, please doesn't get it. Over the Moon kind of captures it.
Oh,
wow. Well, Barry, this is Charles Stolfus. I met you, I guess, a couple of months ago when we had lunch with Bill Dembski, who is one of the leading lights of the intelligent design movement. And it was just fascinating to hear you talk about your areas of expertise, the area of law, area of intelligent design. This book that you wrote, Unforgetting God, it's a fascinating book that draws from your several areas of major expertise. Could you tell our audience why it was that you felt the need to write such a book?
Sure. And so over the years, I've been writing and opposing in my legal career and in the intelligent design movement, materialist, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think that materialism doesn't affect law, well, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. It absolutely does, and here's how. But over the years, I've been thinking to myself, how can people of goodwill believe the things that they're saying? How can they say the things that they're saying? You guys both know that when you're arguing with these people, they argue with a certitude that borders on smugness. Actually, it crosses the border sometimes into smugness all the time. And I kept thinking, that just doesn't make sense. How can that be? And then one day, it hit me. I was reading an article about critical theory. And, of course, critical theory is just materialism applied to human relations, right? That at the end of the day, there's no right, there's no wrong, there are no transcendent moral principles. There's nothing but power, people who have it and people who don't. And I thought to myself, well, wait a minute. If I assume that's true, that that the materialism that they're espousing is true, not only does what they say make sense, it's a logical certainty that what they say makes sense. And so it was like one of those aha moments where I realized that if you accept materialism as a premise, their conclusions naturally follow.
We've got about a minute before the break, but tell us real quickly what materialism is. Define that for us.
Okay. Materialism is fairly easy to describe. It is not everything in the world is reducible to the fundamental forces operating on the fundamental particles. Particles in motion, people say. And there is nothing else. There's no spirit. There's no God. There is no immaterial reality. Everything is material. That's why it's called materialism.
Well, we're talking with Barry Arrington. He is the author of the new book, Unforgetting God. He's in Washington, having sat in on the Supreme Court argument today, and we're glad to hear his firsthand account of that. If you want to find out more about Barry, or you want to get a link to his book, we have that on the Point of View website at pointofview.net. We've got a lot to get into with Barry on this because he goes through several things. It moves through philosophy, it moves through worldview, it moves through Christian apologetics. Stay with us. We'll be back for more of our discussion.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Columnist Barton Swaim wrote about the left's vast lack of knowledge. He focused on it because of the bungled attempts by liberal journalists to describe Charlie Kirk and his impact. He pointed to articles that pieced together random quotations attributed to Charlie Kirk without any context. One of the quotes attributed to him made him sound like a Jew hater of the 1930s. He was, in fact, quoting a social media post that he critiqued, but the liberal journalist responsible for the quotes didn't even stop to think that Charlie Kirk had always been a staunch defender of Israel and the Jewish people. Barton Swaim used to assume that liberals and progressives knew more about their conservative opposites than vice versa. But he says more than one reader pointed to Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. Perhaps one of the people who wrote to him heard my radio commentary 6 years ago on the subject. At the time, I had a co-host who'd argued that both sides of the political spectrum make wrong assumptions about the other. While that is true, conservatives usually know more about liberals than liberals know about conservatives. Jonathan Haidt is probably best known for his books, The Coddling of the American Mind and The Anxious Generation. His book, The Righteous Mind, documents a detailed study of predictions liberals and conservatives made about each other. Moderates and conservatives made the most accurate predictions. Liberals made the least accurate. And I might mention there are other studies, such as the research by Arthur Brooks. He found a significant perception gap when studying Democrats and Republicans. All these studies illustrate why it is important for us to use discernment when consuming media. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on chemical abortion, go to viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. Viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our discussion with Barry Arrington. He is an attorney by profession, but he's written a book called Unforgetting God, which looks at materialism and its impact on the world.
Well, Barry, if we're now in an era of materialism, I think that one of the logical questions that I'm prone to ask is, how did we get here? I mean, if we look back several hundred years, atheism was almost non-existent. And then all of a sudden now we see the dominant worldview is materialism, or even atheism, applied atheism there. The question we might have is, okay, what were the critical forces that brought us to this point in time?
Yes, so that's an excellent question. And one of the things that I get into in the book is the fact that materialism sounds like a newfangled idea, something that's come up recently, but actually it has very ancient roots. Thousands of years ago, the Greeks and the Romans, Democritus and Lucretius, talked about how everything is a result of atoms. Yes, the Greeks talked about atoms bouncing off one another and randomly through trial and error making things work. And it never really got much traction for literally hundreds of years. This theory was kind of in the background. That changed. You can actually point to the year that changed. That changed in 1859 with the publication of Origin of Species. So why did it change? Well, the downfall of Lucretius's theory was, if anybody has ever looked at the human body or an animal body and thought, well, just random atoms bouncing off of one another can't possibly account for the wonderfully intricate, specified complexity of the human body, animal bodies, etc. That's just a non-starter. Well, what did Darwin do? Darwin took that theory and he added one key element. He called on a force that he called natural selection. And according to Darwin, natural selection sorts good variations from bad variations, preserving the former and discarding the latter. And it's not just pure randomness that results in the intricate bodies. It's actually a force of nature that sorts it all out. And that captured the Victorian imagination. Richard Dawkins put it best. He specifically said it would have been impossible to be an atheist prior to Darwin, but relying on pure randomness to explain the living things. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist.
And that's filtered into everything we think, hasn't it?
So one of the books that I quote in my book is The Coming of Darwin, and this was written about 1901. It was 45 years or so after Darwin had published, and it talked about how by that time the Darwinism, and we're not talking about Darwinism written large, not just for biological evolution, but also for things like law and politics and even theology had come to take over the world in the intellectual climate of the time, because the genie of materialism had been freed from the bottle, so to speak.
And that has political implications too, doesn't it?
So that's one of the things I talk about in the books in terms of relationships with each other. If critical theory is true, and all there is particles in motion, and there is no transcendent moral truth, no transcendent principles of justice, that all there is people who have power and people who don't, oppressor and oppressor is the way critical theory thinks of it, then everything boils down to power dynamics. And so when I'm assuming that I'm someone who espouses materialism and I'm a lawyer, when I'm talking about the First Amendment, freedom of speech, well, it used to be that the left was the great champion of freedom of speech when they were trying to normalize pornography, for example. And we had many, many cases come with the ACLU defending the First Amendment. Now it's just exactly the opposite, where the left is trying to shut down speech. And, of course, the case that we had just today, the left is trying to shut down speech, where if a young man comes into a counselor's office and says, help me with these same-sex attractions, help me with this gender dysphoria, the left says, no, you can, and if you try to, we are going to yank your license and fine you $5,000. How did we come from a place where the left was defending free speech to jettisoning free speech? Don't they have a commitment to free speech? And the answer is no, they do not. The critical theory people, the leftists, materialists, do not value free speech as such. They value it only as a tool to advance their political interest. And when that tool has served its purpose, they put it back on the shelf.
Now, Barry, if I was to push back on those kinds of arguments, I might say, but wait a minute, what about my rights? Don't I have certain rights that are given to me by God? And I think in the book you spend a significant amount of time talking about the change, even in law, from a foundation at the colonial period of natural law rights, where the nature of things as established by God, those natural rights that we can understand with our reason, a change from that to where, wait a minute, there are no natural rights, and it's basically wide open to, anything and everything.
And so this very issue blew up on the floor of the United States Senate about 2 weeks ago. You guys are familiar with this. Ted Cruz and Tim Kaine. So Tim Kaine sits on the floor of the Senate and says, you guys are nuts, you're theocracy and you're fascists and you're Nazis. I paraphrase, of course, when you're saying that God gave us rights. That's scary theocratic talk. And Ted Cruz pushes back and says, wait a minute, I've got this document here. Maybe you've heard of it. It says we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. among these life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And so this is a clash that has occurred more than once. In the book, I talk about a political reporter who was, sounding the alarm about Christian nationalism, and someone asked her, "What does that mean?" "Well, these people think that God gave us our rights, and not Congress or the Supreme Court." And did you really think about that before you said it, Senator King? Because who else thinks that there is no God-given right, and where did that lead? And so I talk about it in the book. There are two theories of rights. One is a natural law theory of rights, where rights come from God. We're endowed by our Creator with certain rights. And the other one is, well, particles in motion don't have rights. Rocks aren't right-bearing entities, and the humans are not fundamentally different from rocks in the sense that they're just made from burnout star stuff. And so this thing that people call rights is just language they use in the power game. And I use the Third Reich as an example. Let's say Yitzhak, and I use that name advisedly, of course, says, "I have a right to life." Well, if God gave him a right to life, he absolutely does have that, no matter what any government says. A government might violate that right to life, but it doesn't endow it with him with it. But what if he's in the Third Reich and the government, the Third Reich says, "Well, no, you don't. We don't believe in God, and we believe you don't have a right to life." And here is the critical point. A lot of people don't realize this. Was the Holocaust illegal? No, it was not, in the sense that the Holocaust did not violate any of the internal laws of Germany at the time, because the Germans decided that they were the right bestowers and the right takers awayers, right, to coin a term, and they took away the rights of 6 million Jews to live. So it's Tim Kaine's position that is actually the scary one.
It's interesting because when I used to teach philosophy, and I would ask people the question, some of the students, about should we talk about to other societies about what's right or wrong? And several of the students, no, we can't go judging other societies. And I said, well, was the Holocaust wrong? Oh, yes, the Holocaust was wrong. Isn't that another society? And you get this sort of tension in our world where people on one hand think we shouldn't be judging what other people do, and yet we do judge other people based upon our own rights, based upon what we think and other things all the time.
And I use that very example in the book. Judge Richard Posner. You guys, as non-lawyers, may not have heard of him, but he's maybe the most famous. Beg your pardon?
I know of him, yes.
Yes, sure. He may be the most famous lawyer, other than a Supreme Court justice, in the history of the country. He's been cited. His work, his writings have been cited thousands and thousands of times. He was the chief judge of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, the next court below the Supreme Court, for many years.
Barry, let me get you to hold that thought, because we're coming up to a break. When we come back, we'll finish this thought with Barry Arrington. Stay with us on Point of View.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now, or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome back to Point of View. We're talking with Barry Arrington, an attorney, about his book, Unforgetting God, Defeating Culture-Destroying Materialism Through Christian Renewal. And Barry, I had to cut you off because we're on a mandatory break, but go ahead and finish that thought.
Okay, well, we were talking about Richard Posner, who was this extremely influential judge in the American jurisprudence, maybe the most influential judge in the last 50 years or so in America. And he wrote a law review article. We were talking about the Holocaust and whether you can judge other cultures. And in this law review article, he's a thoroughgoing materialist. He's been called the American Nietzsche because he rejects the concept of transcendent moral norms. He says there is no possible way to judge between two cultures because there's nothing above the cultures. All morality is local, is the way that he puts it. And he said at the Nuremberg trials, the Allied forces punished the Germans, not because what they did was illegal, because it wasn't. As I said, it did not violate any of the internal laws of Germany at the time. It was because they had the power to do it. And we cannot say that the Germans, this is Judge Posner, is what he said. We cannot say the Germans were immoral. We can't say the Holocaust was immoral, period, full stop. The best we can say is the Holocaust was probably not right by our lights. By our lights. And so this is what materialism leads to. And people think, well, influential people don't believe that. Yes, they do. The most influential judge in the last 50 years wrote that there is no transcendent norms that can govern human relations. And we can't say that the Holocaust was immoral in any absolute sense of the word.
Barry, I think another famous Supreme Court justice that you quote from in your book is Oliver Wendell Holmes, probably another at the top of the heap on influence that he's had. And he didn't shy away from the implications from his metaphysics, from his commitment to materialism, a kind of moral nihilism, I think we would say. Here's one quote that you have in the book. He says, I see no reason. This is Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the most influential Supreme Court justices. He says, I see no reason for attributing to a man a significance different in kind from that which belongs to a baboon or to a grain of sand. And what struck me is how many materialists, they're just out there boldly proclaiming the implications of materialism. You're not selectively citing. You're not just kind of getting the most extreme cases. You don't have to go very far to really highlight influential individuals who embrace materialism and the devastating consequences that flow from their thought.
For example, for Oliver Wendell Holmes, you have Buck v. Bell, the infamous eugenics case, where he upheld the eugenics law, and the famous quote from that case was, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So how could Oliver Wendell Holmes get there? Because he was a thoroughgoing materialist. And if you ask a materialist has to do one of two things when they're confronted with the logical consequences of their argument. Because as I said earlier, if you accept their premise that materialism is true, their conclusions just follow naturally. And if you confront them with this, they have one of two things that they can do. They can lie about it and mislead because they don't want the horror of their worldview to be fully exposed, and some of them do that. They try to pretend that they actually believe in objective morality. Or they can be honest about it. And like Richard Posner was honest about it, Justice Holmes was honest about it in his private correspondence. None of his stuff, he had the good grace not to put any of his stuff in the public record. These are from letters back and forth with his correspondence that were published after he died. But Justice Holmes is the kind of the pivotal point in American history, at least as far as law is concerned. We were required, and when I was in law school, to study his article, The Path of the Law. And what did he say there? He said we should eject from the law all notions of morality, because here he actually did say no one really knows what's right and wrong.
Barry,
and that we should realize that the law is nothing but people who have power telling people who don't have power what to do. And in the book, I highlight from how we got from there at the turn of the 20th century when he wrote that article, from the founding era, which was based upon common law. And the common law was kind of encapsulated or summarized in Blackstone's famous commentaries, which were, it's not an understatement to say, the law of the early part of our nation's history. And what did Blackstone's commentaries say about where we got law? Well, of course, it wasn't materialism. He specifically said at the start of his commentaries, law that touches on moral issues comes from the great lawgiver. It is woven into the warp and woof of the universe. And it's not just something that we make up. It's something that we discover. And so here is the critical difference between law up into the time of Holmes and law after Holmes. Our forefathers, including Lincoln, who would told a young lawyer that if he was going to do anything to learn the law, read Blackstone's commentaries all the way through at least twice. That's at the beginning of the study of the law.
Barry,
they believed that law is discovered. It's out there. You discover it. After that, they, like Holmes said, law is something that we make up.
How does the average person sort of negotiate this difficulty? Because there are things, if I'm in Germany, I have a right to drive as fast as I want to on the Autobahn. I do not have the right to do that in the United States. So that sounds like a law that the government gives me. If I am in some states, if I get out of prison, I have the right to vote. In other states, I have to wait till I end probation. In other states, I lose my right to vote. So it's, in one sense, it looks like the government does provide us with certain rights or takes away certain rights, and yet we also talk about natural rights. So how does the average person just sort of work through this? What are my rights and what are my God-given rights versus my state-given rights?
That's an excellent question. And a lot of people tried to besmirch the common law tradition in Blackstone by suggesting that it's just obvious that not all law is God-given. And it's true. But you know what's interesting is that Blackstone would be the first to admit this. When he says that law is given to us by God and we're discovering it, he means law that touches on basic fundamental moral issues. Thou shalt not commit murder. Thou shalt not steal. The Decalogue, if you will. He's not suggesting that every single law passed by government comes from God, which is obviously not true. The way he put it in his commentaries was, God doesn't care about the tariff on wool being imported into England. That's what's called a positive law. Positive means posited, given by government. And so there are two kinds of law. There's the positive law, according to Blackstone, the positive law based on which deals with issues that don't have a fundamental moral basis, like where should the level of tariffs be, what should be the speed limit be. Those are positive law. But there's also the law of given to us by God that should marriage be between one man and one woman. Well, that is something that Blackstone would absolutely insist is something that God gave us and that we stray from that at our peril.
And Blackstone does address that whole issue. There's the civil laws, that some of which maybe vary from place to place, but then we might ask the question, well, what about Christianity? What does Christianity have to say about the nature of the law, how binding it is? I know Blackstone talks about that. I mean, I remember one of the quotes you have in your book. It says, when God created man, he laid down certain immutable laws of human nature. But then you go on to say, or he says, that he also gave man some degree of reason to kind of sort out some of the differences there. What would you have to say about Christianity and our view of rights?
So, excellent question. And here is where I think that we have to be cautious as Christians. We are passionate about the public sphere. because we're called to be salt and light, and we're called to be the people in a culture that prevents the cultural rot. That we have to stand up and say, thus far and no further to government on these basic human issues of marriage and sexuality and life and death. We don't have to speculate, for example, about where Blackstone would be on abortion and terminating the life of unborn babies in their mother's womb. That is one of those issues that does touch upon the law given to us by God. Thou shalt not kill.
Barry, hold that thought. We'll be back after the break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our final segment with Barry Arrington and his book, Unforgetting God. Joining me in studio, Charles Stolfus, who is the director of Denton Bible Church's Theological Institute. And Barry, I had to interrupt you, but go ahead and finish that thought.
Sure, and we were talking about positive law and natural moral law, and it's as Christians we are passionate people in the public sphere, but we should be very careful that we do not let our passion for one area leak over into the other area and, for example, stand up and say, "Thus saith the Lord, the marginal tax rate shall not be more than 28%. Because the Lord does not say thus, right?
I wish he did.
Yeah, I wish he did too. But and as political conservatives, as Christians, and there tends to be a lot of overlap between the two groups, we can go ahead and make our arguments. But they're economic arguments, they're utility arguments, they are family arguments, but they're not, we can be pretty sure that God said, don't kill little babies, but we can't say God said, don't raise the rate of taxation to 29%.
Yeah. Barry, one of the powerful parts of your book is when you address some of the scientific evidences for theism and more broadly Christianity. And I think you either say it's in the book or in an article I read that you were quoted as saying, we are probably in the best place we've ever been as Christians in terms of evidences for the existence of God and really the truthfulness of Christianity. Can you maybe walk us through some of those critical evidences that lead us to belief in God, which is opposite of materialism, but belief in God as really the best interpretation, the best inference from the evidence?
Sure. And of course, the reason that is in the book is it goes back to the very first thing we talked about. If you believe that God does not exist, that materialism is true, everything else follows. If you do believe that God exists, materialism is false, everything else follows the other way. So that one decision note is critical for literally everything that follows, one way or the other. And so I challenge my readers, Christians especially, to bone up on the arguments, and if they're interacting with the culture, and even I challenge true skeptical agnostics or atheists. What is the best evidence or evaluation of the evidence? And I go through a number of different evidences for God. The fact that the universe exists in the first place, the cosmological argument that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and that cause is God. I go into biological intelligent design, and I lean heavily on Bill Dembski's work and how to recognize specified complexity. It can be Bill's genius is to formalize how random chance can be eliminated as an answer. Michael Behe and Stephen Meyer, I talk about their work, and I don't go into a lot of depth in all of these. I just kind of sketch each of them out, and I point to other resources for where people who want to go into depth. But the point that I try to make in the book is that it's not just one thing. You got proof after proof after proof after proof after proof for the existence of God. And as a lawyer, I understand how a case is proven. It's not just one piece of evidence usually. It is the totality of the evidence that gets you to get to the jury to say, yep, your case makes sense.
Barry, what do you do with the what some people perceive as a tension between science and religion?
And so what I say whenever someone says that there's a tension between science and religion is, well, probably the greatest scientist who ever lived, and I think there's kind of a general consensus on this, is Isaac Newton. Because everything after his work, there's pre-Newton and there's post-Newton. The scientific world is really cut off there because his work is just so foundational to the scientific worldview today. And you know what? Isaac Newton wrote more about theology than he wrote about science. So he didn't think that there was a tension between science and religion. The early Christian sciences and science came up in Christian Western Europe and not in any other place in the world. Why? Because science is compatible with Christianity. One early Christian scientist said, when I'm doing my science, what I'm doing is thinking God's thoughts after him. And so there's no tension between God and science. As a matter of fact, science depends upon a natural, moral, and physical law. And if there's a natural physical law, there's a natural physical lawgiver.
Well, Barry, I think, as we listen to your arguments here, we realize that the ideas have consequences and that materialism has implications. And we've seen over the last several hundred years at least how those implications have been corrosive to modern society. And of course, theism has positive benefits. It provokes me to ask the question, can we have an ordered society at all if indeed there is no God? I mean, is it even possible? Or is materialism doomed in the end?
I've asked myself this very question a number of times over the last couple of years because it seems like, to me, that the competition between those who believe in objective, transcendent principles of justice and morality, and those who don't, is heating up. And as it heats up, our politics are starting to devolve into tribalism, where each tribe gets together and advances its interests in a war of all against all, and it's a zero-sum game. And I've asked myself, what the Democrats or progressives have been are kind of the party of materialism, and I don't say that. That's just not my view. That's every poll that you see is that overwhelmingly the party of those who do not necessarily have a religious commitment skews left. Those who have a religious commitment skews right. And so what has happened in the politics is that competition is starting to heat up, and it's starting to turn violent. And can that oil, that Republican oil and the Democrat water, be mixed together in the long term? We are, as Lincoln said, a house divided. We are divided more than we've been in the last 160 years. And I think that's an open question, Charles. I don't know is the answer.
Well, Barry, I
hope so.
I do too. Barry, I want to thank you for joining us. We've been talking with Barry Arrington about his book, Unforgetting God. We'll have a link to that on our website at pointofview.net. Thank you so much, Barry, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful time.
Oh, he did a great job with that, Charles.
Absolutely. I think one of the things I like about this interview is that there's hope at the end. In fact, he ends his book with that, the idea that that God is our best hope for personal salvation and cultural renewal.
And Charlie Kirk played a role in that. Yeah, he sure did. Well, I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank Megan for being our engineer, Steve for producing, and thank you for listening. So I encourage you to go to pointofview.net. You can find out more about Barry Arrington there. I think there's a link to his book that you'll be able to get. And while you're there, there is a donate button. Well, I encourage you to give that button a push and donate a little bit. Thank you for joining us here on Point of View.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.